Hello, I'm glad you're with us again today. I want to start out today by asking you a question. How would you react to me or greet me if you didn't know me and you ran into me, say, in a parking lot at the grocery store or somewhere else? I might pull up and get out of my nice new clean car, dressed in nice clothing, spit-shined shoes, and maybe a sports coat as I have on today. I've got a smile on my face. I believe that most people would be cordial to me and speak to me. Most people would have a smile on their face and say, "Hello, how are you doing?" I don't believe that the majority of people would feel uneasy speaking to me. But what if the circumstances were a little different? Let's say I was dressed a little differently. What if I drove up, not in my new car, but rather on a motorcycle, and instead of having on a sports jacket like this, I have on my riding vest. Then I could add my skull cap to go underneath my helmet and add a couple of gloves that would not only be comfortable for me to wear, but also if I had an accident, it would help to keep my knuckles from getting skinned. And, don't forget my sunglasses to protect my eyes. How about now? Do you think that I would get the same welcome? Probably not from everyone. I'm the same person, but I look quite differently, don't I? And you might say, well, would that really happen? Well, yes. It's actually happened to me before, under different circumstances, of course. Some years back, when I owned some rental property, I went to a bank to cash a rental check that someone had given me. I took it directly to their bank because I'd had some problems before with them. I was dressed in a suit and looked pretty clean cut. I took the check to the teller and asked her if I could have it cashed. She greeted me with a smile and started my transaction. After a moment, she said, "Sir, I'm sorry, but there is insufficient funds in this account to cash this check today. Bring it back tomorrow, and I'll check it again for you." So I thanked her, and I went on my way. Now, the next day was a work day for me as far as my other rentals were concerned. I had some work to do, so I was dressed in my work clothes, my work overalls that was worn, tattered in places, and paint splattered. I was also wearing an old, worn-out baseball cap. I went to the same teller at the same bank that I was with the day before. I recognized her, but she didn't recognize me. I asked her if she could see if there were sufficient funds to cash the check. She looked at me and hesitated because I looked differently. And she said, "Sir, you'll have to see one of the ladies at the desk behind you to get this authorized." That was it. Rejected. She didn't want to help me. And the question would be, why? What was the difference? Well, I believe the answer is very simple, and you probably do too. She was looking at me in a totally different light. I no longer fit into that accepted mold that she envisioned. The problem is, I believe that we do this far too often when it comes to our worship. And you say, what do you mean? Well, consider a family coming into town on Sunday morning. They're dressed nicely. They come into our door at our building, and we make our way toward them, or we scoot over on the pew so that they might have a place to sit. And we speak to them and welcome them to our worship, always with a smile on our face. And I'm reminded of a scripture over in Acts chapter 10, where it says, "In truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons," or shows no partiality. Wow, we passed the test. We treated them no differently than we treated others about us. But what happens when someone else visits us for the first time and they are quite different outwardly? This time, the person comes in dressed in worn, tattered, maybe outdated clothing, certainly not what we're accustomed to seeing on Sunday morning. Their hair is not neatly cut or combed, or at least as we would have it. They might even have a bit of body odor about them. And they come in and sit right next to us. We catch them by the corner of our eyes, but we don't speak. We don't introduce ourselves to them or welcome them. Actually, we're sort of hoping that they might move to another pew. You don't want to talk with them because they're probably there for a handout, for food or money anyway. So you continue through the worship hour, looking at your watch nervously every few minutes, wondering when it will end. You know, there used to be a popular saying that went around that said, "What would Jesus do?" Well, Scripture tells us what Jesus would do in those situations. One day we read that he was approached by a leper. Now, guys, back in that time, you didn't even walk on the same side of the street with a leper, much less talk to one, and under no circumstances ever touch one. But notice in Matthew chapter 8, it begins in verse 2, and it says, "Behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.'" What would Jesus do? Nervously sit there, look out of the corner of his eye, ignore the fact that the man talked to him? No, verse 3 says Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." Wow! Jesus went the second mile. Not only did he speak to this man, this leper, but he actually touched him. And Jesus does the same to other people. Do you remember the story of Matthew, who was the tax collector? Those Jews, his own people, hated him. Why? Because he worked for the Roman government. He was taking money from the Jews and giving it to the Romans. They didn't want to have anything to do with him. And Jesus comes along, looks down at him and says, "Matthew, follow me." Jesus wanted him to be a part of his ministry. And he did the same with the Samaritan woman at the well. If you recall, he and his disciples were headed north and they went through Samaria. The disciples, when they got into town, says, "We're going to go get some food." So Jesus goes to the well to get a drink. As far as we know, Jesus and this woman were the only people there. So Jesus asked for a cup of water. Now, guys, again, if you were a Jew, you didn't carry on conversations with Gentiles, especially with a woman. And even more than that, one who had a shady background like this woman had. But not only does Jesus talk with her, he offers her everlasting life. So, how do we wrap our finite brains around something like this? Well, I believe that Jesus summed it up best as he spoke in John 13:34. He says this, "A new commandment I give to you." Now, when Jesus says a new commandment, we'd better listen. We need to find out what he's talking about. And then he says that you love one another. And we say, "How, Jesus?" And he says, "As I have loved you, that you also love one another." And then we say, "Well, why, Jesus?" Verse 35, he says, "By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." You know, that pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? We are to love others as Jesus has loved us. How much did he love us? He gave his life for us. How do we love others around us? How do we accept them? What we have to do is get through the outer shell and see the beauty of that inner person. And I say the beauty of that inner person because we're told in the very first chapter of Genesis that we are made how? In the image of God. And what greater beauty is there than being made in the image of God? So the next time you might feel uncomfortable speaking to someone or welcoming someone, remember this: God is giving you an opportunity to be more like him. I hope you have a wonderful day. God bless.